All right, we're sold out. So thanks for coming and trucking over here from the main building. My name is Tobias Dengel. I'm with a company called WillowTree. We're an agency. We mainly focus, originally 10 years ago, on app development, now on anything digital, and voice is a big piece of that. So the good news today is I am completely platform agnostic. I'm technology agnostic. I'm really just here to talk about what we see happening with our clients in the financial services space and answer any questions you might have. So it's very high level. And I'll dive into a couple examples that we're working on throughout the presentation. I will also share this with you, so you don't need to take pictures of the slides. You're welcome to, but more easily I can probably just email it to you after the presentation if you so desire. So we've spent a lot of time on voice in the last 2 or 3 years. We get asked all the time by clients what seems like a very simple question. What's the next big thing, right? And 10 years ago, this mobile wave hit us out of nowhere, but for those of us who were in tech for a while, we've been chewing around the edges of mobile for about 5-6 years before that. Those of you remember back then in the early 2000s, I was at AOL. There was WAP websites. And so mobile seemed like just another interface, another way to get at the same stuff that was on the web for a long time. And I think one of the presenters this morning made the point, when does something transition from being kind of a new GUI and a new interface to actually something that's fundamentally changing how human beings interact with technology? And we think that is voice in a big way. And part of the presentation today is to go through why we think that, and then what the challenges are, why we're not quite there yet. So the big question that was asked a couple times this morning, overall in the space, is on the one hand, we are in the middle of the fastest adoption of any technology in history. Right? Mary Meeker said last year, voice was the fastest adoption. Previous record holder was smartphones. Before that, it was the internet. Before that, I think it was color television. So people are drawn to it in some sort of very massive and significant way. But in terms of most of our businesses out in the market, there are very few huge success cases, right? No one is saying right now, voice completely changed my business, or voice has made X, Y, Z easier in a kind of massive way. There are folks doing it, of course. I still think one of the Bibles of the digital space is the book Crossing the Chasm, which is, I think, 25 years old at this point. But the thesis back then, in the mid-'80s, late '80s, when that book was written, maybe even early '90s, was whenever you get a new technology, there's always a lunatic fringe that starts using it, right? And so right out of the gate, everyone gets super pumped and says, oh my God, this is the next thing. But then if it doesn't get massive traction, it never goes over what he called crossing the chasm to the mainstream. And the question is always, is every new tech that we're looking at, is this something neat and cool that a couple really big techies like? Like, I don't know. I certainly think in terms of mass adoption, VR is still in that category. 5 years ago, if you talked to someone at CES, what would they tell you was the next big thing? 3D television, right? It was going to be in every house by like 80% market share by 2020. None of us probably at this point, unless we're on that lunatic fringe, have a 3D TV. And so the question is always, what is on that lunatic fringe and what's kind of truly going to grab the masses and change the way we work? And we believe ultimately it's how useful it is to doing things we already do and how useful it is in terms of living our lives every day, making them easier, better. So a lot of what we do as an agency is really focus on the psychology of the end user and then not seeing technology as something cool in search of an application, but really twisting that on its side and saying, what are the real problems that people have? Does this solve it in some way, and how can we make that work? So the area I'm going to focus on is financial services because that is, a third to a half of our business. We're really deep into it. And I think it just provides, even if you're not in financial services, it provides a pretty good illustration of what's going on in the market. So, like every industry, we all know financial services is under a ton of pressure from disruptors. And this is really new in the financial services business because it's a very old business going back, to Roman times or earlier. And for most of the last, 100 years in the U.S., it was a pretty protected business, A, from a regulatory standpoint, but B, also from just barriers to entry, right? To be any kind of financial institution of scale, you needed a ton of money. You had to build branches, you had to build a brand. That was really hard to do. Those things are changing over the last 10 years. A lot of industries, retail started getting hit 15, 20 years ago. Music, back when we were at AOL, because the first industry to get massively impacted. Yellow Pages, anyone remember those? Used to be more money spent in the U.S. on Yellow Pages advertising than on all radio and magazine advertising combined. And that was 15 years ago. 15 years ago. And now it's zero, basically. Not all the way to zero, but pretty close. And so financial services is experiencing that for the first time. And when you look at what's going on, there's a ton of money in Silicon Valley going into this space. And what's interesting when you look at who's investing and what these companies do, first of all, it touches everything, right? It touches lending, right, on the theory that a better user experience and AI and crowdsourcing are smarter than a loan officer, ultimately, is what the bet is. Personal finance has been around for a while, things like Credit Karma, which have a great user experience, easy to use. Payments, the original, back in the day, that's what started all with PayPal when they went completely outside of the system. But now we're also seeing real innovation in the B2B side, the back office side. All this is happening at once, and all this is happening. This is over the last 2 to 3 years. All this money is pouring in. What's interesting about it, when you look at every single one of these spaces, is what these companies are not doing and what they are doing. So one thing they are not doing is anything new, right? There's nothing here that doesn't get done today by the largest financial institutions on the planet. But what they are doing is making it a significantly better user experience. It's all based on UX. And all you have to do is look at, if folks don't think UX matters, you just have to look at what's happened with taxis over the last 6 or 7 years. Uber is ultimately, we've always had taxis, you could always hail a cab. They just used the technology to make it easier, better, more efficient, trackable, reliable. You actually knew who your driver was, safe. Even though you're using private cars, it's safer. It's, a million things. But ultimately, it's just a better user experience. And so you have to believe that a better user experience wins over time today. And so Ken Dodelin, this is a funny slide because we were putting this deck together 10 days ago, and the team came up with this quote from Ken Dodelin. Ken and I actually worked together at AOL 20 years ago. Called him Kenny D. He is one of the senior folks over at Capital One. And this quote to me is super, super insightful because most clients come to us, whether in financial services or elsewhere, and they say, we want to get more engaged with our end users. We want to spend more time with them. We want to create more value for them. What I think most of the companies on the last slide are doing, and what Kenny D talks about right here, is consumers want the opposite. They want less time. They want less shit from their bank. They just want to get things done. That's what banking is to them, right? And that's what the entire focus of how we collectively think about the user experience needs to be. And so then you get to voice, right? And you've got, this is an idealized world of what voice could do for banking. We just think this is unrealistic for all sorts of reasons. First of all, how common is this use case really that you would just pay your bill cold, right? I know that there are certain millennials, et cetera, who would do it like that. But for most of us, we either have it on auto pay or we actually want to look at it. So this concept, this doesn't solve very much, right? In certain cases it does. It might be exciting and fun a couple of times. The other problem is there's a huge authentication issue that's not relevant, and like not even pointed out in this example. You probably have more accounts. You actually don't pay Visa ever. So this is kind of a popularized version of what the experience could be. The real experience in life is super, super complex. But we can get close to this. And what I want to talk about today is what are the steps we need to take to get closer to this, and what are the hang-ups in the system? And primarily from the point of human psychology. So first of all, when it comes to financial institutions, privacy is king. Privacy and trust, those two things. And this concept of a device that's always listening, specifically and especially vis-a-vis financial institutions, we think is going to be problematic over time. We did a poll of about 700 end users asking them what would be the number to rank why they wouldn't use Alexa to do something like pay their bills. What do you think the number one answer was? Security, privacy. They specifically said, I don't want Amazon to know my bank balance. The interesting thing about that is, I don't know if anyone from Amazon's in the room, but I don't know that, I can't even answer that question with 100% certainty that if you used Alexa, an Alexa skill, if Amazon actually has that info and what they might do with that info. And so that is concern one, especially a lot of the things that have happened with Amazon and Facebook over the last year. And I think that's well understood. And there are ways we think around that. The second issue is something called the Uncanny Valley that's going on right now that I think everyone needs to understand. So the Uncanny Valley is actually a very old concept. It started in the 70s in Japan when they were looking at how lifelike can they make robots. And it turns out the more lifelike you make something until you get it perfect, the more it freaks people out, right? And there's all kinds of psychological reasons for that. It's why zombies are scary and corpses are scary. It's because it's kind of human, but it's not exactly human. So there's part of that. We think a huge part of it is trust, which is particularly important to financial institutions. Humans develop trust, there's kind of two categories of trust, right? There's affective or emotional trust, and there's cognitive trust. Affective or emotional trust is not based on anything except for how I feel about you. And when we meet for the first time, it is the only basis typically of trust that I have, right? So for humans, it's based on pattern recognition. It can get really hard across cultures. In Western culture, it's heavily is a person looking me in the eye? How strong is his or her handshake? Do they seem confident, right? In other cultures, it might be different. But ultimately, we have no real basis. That's why introductions are so important. That's why references are so important. But we have no basis for it as humans in the moment. Then over time, we build cognitive trust. Cognitive trust is really built on a simple premise, which is, does this person do what they say they are going to do? And how often, how repetitive that is it builds trust over time. Now, when you get to machines, it's really, really interesting. When we look at a computer, our trust, we never go through typically, some would argue, Apple products are different, but typically for a computer, we never go through this affective or emotional trust cycle. We only look at the device because we don't think of it as human at all on a cognitive basis. Does it do what it's going to say it's going to do at a fair price? Very easy. When we start looking at things like voice, what happens is the closer they seem to human, the more we judge them on emotion, and we cannot help that. And that's what gets really, really difficult, especially for financial institutions, when you start talking about voice experiences that have a personality. And so we've done a bunch of testing, and it turns out consumers trust, especially in financial services, but in a lot of other places, voice experiences much more that sound more robotic and less human, but are just really good at getting stuff done, like making a payment, checking a balance, etc., versus a quasi-human experience like, obviously Alexa, but even going to things like Bank of America's Erica is in that direction, right? And there's all this work being done right now on your voice is your brand and spending all this money trying to figure out what should the voice of the brand look like, what should the tonality be, what should the sense of humor be. I can tell you our research is pretty clear. Most people don't want their bank to have a sense of humor. They really don't want that. It turns them off. I was late getting home last week, and this thing struck me because as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, I was leaving the exit. We're down in Charlottesville, Virginia, which has 2 lanes to leave the airport parking. After 10 p.m., 1 lane has an attendant in it. The other lane, you just put in your credit card. Where do you think all the cars were? In 1 lane, there were 5 cars. In the other, there were 0. What?
They were at the attendant.
No. They were all at the credit card. Every single one. So I drove to the attendant, even though I wanted to go to the credit card one. Because I think there's this thing going on. People just don't want to interact with strangers more than you have to. And when you start giving your voice a personality, you're again putting people into this dreadful thing like you feel like when you got to call customer service. You don't really care about the process, although the process can be painful. You really care about, am I going to be treated nicely by the person on the other end? Because if I'm usually calling because I'm not a trivial problem, especially if I'm calling an airline, and now I'm going to be in a fight with the person on the other end. Like, that's the last thing I need. And so all this points to a world where the goal is actually to have, at least now in the current evolution, less personality versus more. And that's great news, because that makes everything a lot easier, and it makes everything a lot cheaper. This is, an example of this today. Have any of you guys seen the recent Cats trailer? Yeah. This is like the hot meme on the internet right now. Everyone's talking. This is like in the last 2 weeks. I don't know this stuff. I've got like 85 20-year-olds that point this stuff out to me. But this is the hot topic right now, is how they created these characters, and they, on top of, I don't exactly know how they did it, but somehow they're so close to human but not quite human that everyone on the internet is talking about how it's just completely freaky. So that it's a little bit about privacy and security. The third element to why we're even here, kind of what you need to do, is speed. And you really need to break apart. Everyone talks about voice being faster, and it is, right? We type, on average, as adults, at 40 words a minute. If you're an adult on your thumbs, it might be 25. If you're a teenager on your thumbs, it might be 60. But it's in that range. But we speak at 130, right? And that's why, ultimately, we all have this inclination that we want to get something done. We just want to talk it. Like, we just want to tell Siri what we want. The problem is when the device talks back to us and we're listening to Alexa, to Siri, it's also at 130 words a minute. But if we were to read the same information, it's 250, right? And so that is the core insight that kind of takes you to the next place, which is when you look at what's been computing for the last, since it started till about 8-9 years ago, is we typed it 40, we read it 250. That was kind of the interface we have with computers. Now, in these voice-first experiences, or voice-only experiences especially, we're at 130, and your overall experience is slower, right? And that is, we think, a core underpinning of why it's taken so long for these voice experiences to really take off. But what we believe is going to happen next is this concept of multimodal, which the Microsoft folks talked a lot about this morning, and we think is very clearly where everything's going to go, which is you're going to speak and they're going to read a response. And that 250 is even faster if you can get a graphical response and you can look at an image of something. That might be much faster than reading the words. And so we do this every day today, right? You speak a text message, and then you read the response. You leave a voicemail. Who still listens to the voicemail on their phones? I don't, unless the transcription's garbled. But 90% of the time, I read the voicemail because of this right here. It's faster. I'll give you another example. One of our clients is Regal Cinemas. So we worked on a demo with them where you can ask, Alexa skill. Everyone wants an Alexa skill. Alexa skill for finding and buying a movie ticket, which is a top, Fandango was one of the first 5 that launched with, or first 10 or so skills, like right when the Alexa launched. So asking Alexa what movies are playing tonight is really freaking easy. Getting a response is a disaster, right? Because that's movie phone. That's 10 movies, 5 showtimes each. Can't remember what the third one was once you have the 6th one. It's just a disaster, right? So what the demo was that we came up with them is you ask Alexa or Siri, whatever, where the movies are, and then within the app, you get a notification, opens up the app to the movies tonight. Then you look at your phone or you look at your device and say, all right, 2 tickets for Star Wars at 8 p.m. tonight. And so those are the use cases that we think are going to be the place where everything goes. And I'll play a little video for you. This is a test case. This is a made-up Pizza Planet. I think it's made up. And kind of compared to what it would take to do the same thing on in an app.
Let me get a cheese pizza with bacon, chicken, mushrooms, and olives,
So on the left
a buffalo
is the
chicken
voice.
pizza with onions and peppers,
On the right is
and a veggie pizza
doing
with
it by
extra
hand
cheese.
in an app. So those 3 pizzas took about 10 seconds when processed properly. And this was based on, 20, 30 folks that we had go through the test. This is, I don't think it's a crazy use case. It's not like we faked something where you have like 13 different toppings and some like half and half bizarro combination. And I think people would say, yeah, it takes about that long. It takes about 40 seconds to a minute, maybe 2 minutes to order a pizza on an app today. And it would take 10 seconds to order a pizza on an app using voice. But what's interesting there, it's voice initiated, right? Part of the value here is that you can't do this on Alexa unless you have total trust. Alexa is a standalone. Because Alexa might tell you, all right, we got your order, but you would be freaked out. What makes this so valuable is that you have the instant feedback that we got the order right. And so there are kind of 3 different pieces of this experience, right? So the speech one is obvious. I'm going to use a couple examples from Synchrony Bank, whom we work with. And so how much money do I have in an account? There's text. Now, you can integrate that into Siri, or you can send people right into the app. And we think that second version is what is going to win over time, although there are use cases for both. And then there's the graphical version. So that you can even, you could put graphs in there, et cetera, but you can start transmitting so much data instantly to human beings much more effectively than you've ever been able to do before, because you have the fastest way to ask for it and the fastest way to respond. And so I'm just going to show you, this is what the live Synchrony banking app does today. This is if you were to sign in from scratch. So first of all, you've got Touch ID. It's very fast. This is if you enable Siri. You have to do this one time. And then you're instantly able to get into your app in this case. But you did it through the app, not through Siri itself.
Show my Ellie and Matt account.
Which app would you like to use?
Synchrony Bank.
Here is your Synchrony Bank account.
So you
Check
saw
my
that,
Synchrony Bank balances.
and you see Siri screwed it up.
Here are your
But we were
Synchrony
still
Bank
able to get
accounts.
them the right response. So that, we think, kind of generally speaking, is where this is all going. And we think most of it is going to be with the app. For those of you who use the Waze app, you've probably noticed over the last 12 months already, there's a giant mic button. Now, Waze specifically has that as a use case because you're usually driving when you're using it. Always a passenger when I'm using it, but other people might be driving. But But it's a mic button within the app, and I think you're going to start seeing that mic button within the app everywhere for this exact use case. So there's been very little research done on what consumers actually want with voice. I think you always have to be careful because what consumers tell you they want and what they really do can be often quite different. But it gives you a guideline. So we asked consumers to rank those 14 things that are the most popular kind of categories on Alexa, depending on how you categorize them. How efficient this is and how useful is each one? And it follows a pretty straight line, as you might expect, although we weren't sure of that going into it. People might say it's super efficient, but I don't care. It turns out that it's a fairly linear relationship. If it's more efficient, people find it more useful and vice versa. And we kind of categorized these into three things. So people actually felt things like customer service today are not really what they're interested in out of the gate, using, again, the Alexa example. That was the issue. But where they felt this top cluster was where voice today, in a voice-only experience, where it adds value to them is one is training. Lots of training, lots of courses going on, can be very interactive. Access to audio content, contacting someone, generating a list. That's a great obvious use case when you're like around the kitchen, you're like, I need more lettuce. And Alexa, that's great. But the biggest one to us is this one right here, specific search or deep search. That's where we think voice is going to be the breakthrough. And those are the interactions that we think are going to be the most valuable. And it's not just on the consumer side. So we're working with Pepsi right now, and we've got their reps in the field that can order parts for Pepsi machines while they're there, right, using voice. Because previously, this is a great piece of data. How long did it take the average technician in the field to order a part once they knew what the part was? It was 42 minutes. Because they had to reference two catalogs, the kind of company catalog, then the manufacturer catalog. They had to correlate those numbers, and then they had to call a call center and get that transmitted. It just takes a ton of time. We have that down to less than a minute now, where they're like, I need a dollar bill changer, partially because of voice, and we can then confirm it, is it this one? But we also have geolocation. We know what machine you're in front of. We know that dollar bill changer is the most, that's broken 60% of the time, blah, 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 blah. But those are the kinds of efficiencies we're seeing on the back office. So the question then becomes, where should one invest? Like, how does one even go about that? If you believe what I'm telling you is true, how do you go about it? And I think there's lots of good news, and then there's lots of areas for investment. So first of all, when you break voice down, there's kind of three main steps. One is you got to recognize what people are saying, right? Then you have to find the meaning, and then you have to find the appropriate response. So let's break those down for a second. The good news is, if you're in a major company, you don't have to worry about the recognition, right? You get that from Google, from Amazon, from Microsoft. They all have different versions of it. That's where, I'm sure Amazon has said it today. Amazon has 10,000 people working on voice right now. A big chunk are here on the recognition, the transcription. Like, how do I know, given all the different accents, age, blah, 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 can I get the words right? None of us, at least, have to worry about that very much. We've got lots of tools. We can test them. We can figure out which works best in our scenario. The other big advantage we have is we are dealing with narrow use cases, right? The hardest part about the hardest part about the next step, meaning, is when you are a Siri, as an example, or an Alexa or a Google Assistant, you basically have to understand all human existence at some level to be able to have great responses, right? The famous quote from Steve Jobs, he approved Siri to go when he asked Siri, are you a man or a woman? And Siri responded, no gender has been assigned to me. And so that was kind of his side, okay, this thing is kind of ready to go. But those are really, really, really hard problems to solve. And as happened with Microsoft, they can easily be tricked. But we don't have to worry about that because all we're trying to do is get someone a bank balance. We don't want to tell someone a joke. We don't need to be funny. In fact, we don't want to be funny. We just want to, as soon as it's outside of the rails, we can just say, we're not doing that in some way. But this is where large companies have a huge advantage. And that's in figuring out what things mean. So again, we don't have to worry about all the AI, right? The AI, machine learning, all that gets given to us by Microsoft and friends. They give us the systems by which to process meaning. We then have to feed the system the information. And I think the Microsoft presenter said this morning that when they kind of seed a proper system, they use hundreds of years, human years worth of data to get that system going. And that's where large financial institutions have such a massive advantage in training the model out of the gate. Because you have, for those of you in the room from large financial institutions, you have millions of years of recorded data, and you have tens of thousands of personnel that you can get to create data on how to seed the system. Like, what are the 50 ways someone might ask for their account balance? What are the top 10 issues you face every day as a call service rep? You have that data in ways that startups do not. And so that training that model is where there needs to be a massive amount of investment. And then the earlier one starts, the better the model gets, because we always joke it's artificial intelligence. It's you put the data in, you see what happens. You have humans look at the results. All right, someone asked this question. They asked, what's my balance going to be tomorrow? What they really asked is, when's my check going to clear? Or is my check going to be clear by tomorrow? Did the system interpret that correctly? And you have humans go through and say, check X, check X, check X. And then the system gets smarter and smarter on the basis of that. That's kind of how this whole thing works. Like, we don't have to worry so much about all the algorithms in the background. There's an arms race with billions of dollars being spent to make those better. We just have to worry about training the models. And then the other place to invest and to spend time on is, what is the user experience of the response, right? How do we decide when we give a verbal response, and how do we decide when to give a text response or a graphic response? And we're just going to get collectively better at that over time. But that's where I think the deep integrations to the apps make such a big difference, because most of that graphic and text response has already been delivered, right? All you have to do is use voice to trigger the right page, you don't have to rebuild anything. It's actually pretty inexpensive, at least out of the gate. So Bain did a study, so it must be true, that if you look at the banking industry in the US, just solving the most basic queries, which they say represent 60% of calls into call centers, things like check my balance, transfers, those kinds of things, those top 5 calls, as they said, that if you could put those into voice, which is kind of the same experience, faster experience for users, costs about $4 incrementally to handle each one of those calls in a call center, even if most of them are handled by IVR, again, according to Bain. Costs about 10 cents incrementally if it's a voice-only experience, because you don't have any of the telco costs, et cetera. They're looking at the average bank in the U.S., mid-sized regional, et cetera, is looking at $70, $80 million a year in saving on a $5 to $20 million, and obviously it's a big range. But the ROI on this stuff is huge right out of the gate for just the simple stuff. This isn't like, let's make Erica. This is, let's solve like the top 5 problems that are hitting our call center every day. And so that's where we're spending a lot of time. And what we believe the industry, where we believe the industry is going, is giving a voice to apps, right? Because the multimodal, the response piece is already built. All you have to layer on top is the triggering piece, kind of how you get to the right place in the app as fast as possible. All right. Questions. We got about 10, 12 minutes. It's hot in here. Yes.
What would you say is like the sweet spot for like age range of people that are willing to work with like voice technology?
So someone said it today, which I think we see in the data. It's the first time that my kids and my parents are talking to me about the same stuff. I don't know if that's entirely true. I think for if you can get around the issues around security and privacy, we think that it's really broad-based. We think that all the data would show you, millennials, at least up till now, care a lot less about, they say they care about privacy, but as de fact, they actually don't do anything about it, whereas, especially when it comes to financial, folks over 40 are really conservative. But when we think it's done this way and it's in the app and there's clear and there's a lot of the things you can do in the app to indicate to a user that something is secure. You can do a lot of little tricks that you wouldn't be able, like for example, like just putting a little locked symbol like under a current, like under your account balance, just to indicate some indicator of security. Go really, really long way. Yep.
So right now in the agency industry, how are people determining and testing the UX experience? What's everyone doing right now to make sure they've got that right?
Yeah. So there's a multi-levels, right? So early, we try to do just general surveys, which, let's say they're 50% accurate, plus or minus. The second thing is we actually do user testing at scale using services like usertesting.com. There's a bunch of them out there where you can say, all right, you can get incredibly specific. You can say, I want, males over 55 with an income over 100,000. And I want only those people to test these 3 screens. And you give them the screens, and they go through the process, and you get the aggregated results, you get videos, et cetera. And then we do a lot in our office. So we have like a full testing lab where we bring in people. You have like 7 cameras. Usually have us and the clients behind like one-way mirrors, kind of all watching. For our clients, usually they're like, this is the funnest part of the year. I just get to have people like using the app and commenting real time on how they're looking. But you can't. That is usually the most valuable. It's just expensive and time consuming. But you have to do all those things, or you just can't get at the truth. And then you just got. And then on top of that, even in that environment, people do things differently than they do in real life. It's like, what do doctors famously say? Like, what people say they're going to do and what they do in the jungle of life,
So
in terms of medication.
Right now, I mean, there's no agencies have really figured that out.
Yeah, and I don't know that. I think there's an exact science around figuring it out. And I think what happens over time is you start looking at comparative. It's kind of like aggregated artificial intelligence in a sense. You look at what everybody else is doing, what's working, and you kind of like, oh, that person has tried that. That seems to be working. We're going to try that. Did it work for us? Did it not work for us? But it takes a long time. I mean, if you look at, website or even apps most recently, like 5 years, just news apps, right? Take, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. 5 years ago, those apps all look completely different. Now they all look pretty much, different color scheme, but like everyone's got the same nav pattern basically. Everyone's got the same approach to how ads are inserted, but it took 10 years. And so I think that's kind of where we are in the evolution right now. Yep.
You talked a little bit about the robotic voice versus a little bit more of a human personality. Any research or findings around actually naming the voice or virtual assistant?
So there's a ton of it. A lot of it is conflicting. And I think a lot of it really depends on the specific use case. There's a lot of reasons in my mind not to name it. Some of it is this valley of uncanny. Then there's like the whole gender issues, right? The huge majority of voice assistants now are female. And the reason is that men and women psychologically, have a easier time, well, according to the research, of telling a woman what to do than a man what to do. And that's super effed up. I've got 4, well, it is because I've got 4 kids. And what are my 4 kids growing up doing? Bossing Alexa around in ways that are not super nice. Like, Alexa, shut up. And I'm like, guys, what's going on here? And they're like, it's just a machine. I'm like, this is not good. So I think there's a lot of reasons right now, and this has certainly been an issue over the last year. That folks have tried to make genderless voice assistants, which I think is interesting because they also, in some ways, sound less like what you would hear less commonly in your normal life. So anyway, it's a tough topic, but I would, it goes back to we just don't think all this stuff is ready enough to attempt to be human. And it's, what was the Microsoft, that little thing that used to follow you around like 20 years ago on your screen, like Clippy? It's like that kind of thing that we're going to laugh at. Like, wait, they gave it a name? Like, that's just preposterous. It's a machine. It's supposed to do a job.
Are certain industries more receptive to voice technology than others?
Yeah, I mean, there are clear use cases where a lot of what I say doesn't apply, right? So music is the most obvious one, right? So people are using voice to activate music experiences completely. There's no reason for a screen. But things like reading off recipes potentially, making lists. What else is there? Obviously the news, any kind of media, generally speaking, is kind of in a different boat than we are here. Although not entirely. I mean, I always use my kids as examples. I flew JetBlue a couple months ago, and I always thought, JetBlue is the coolest. They've got all the TV channels, like it's the high tech. And after we landed, I was like, "What'd you guys think? This is awesome." And they're like, "I hated it. That was terrible." And I'm like, "Was your screen broken? What's going on?" He's like, "No, they have these things called channels. You can't figure it out. I was just wanted to watch something, and what is this thing?" And I was like, that's where we're going. Just because they're used to, we don't really watch traditional TV in our house. We have an Apple TV, and they just say what they want, and they get it. And they're like, why should it be any different on a plane? But that's going to be for all of us in everything, I think. Right, that's where we're going. Yep.
Going off of your question, taking the content from last year's Voice Summit and this year's, there's a lot of healthcare sessions and less on financial services. Now, healthcare industry is still concerned with security and privacy, just like financial industry. So why do you think there's so much being done in healthcare versus financial?
That's a really good question. We do some stuff in healthcare. I think in healthcare there's some very specific use cases that even in a voice-only environment create a ton of value right out of the gate. So an example is the hospital room. We're doing work with a company that has a lot of equipment in hospital rooms. They want to be the hub of the whole system there, and they're trying to replace what is now a nurse call button that just, that's, for those of you who've been in the hospital recently, that's still what it is in most hospitals. You push a button and the nurse shows up, and it could be I need water or I'm having a heart attack, and they're using voice experiences to solve something like that, and that's like a clear as day use case that can be voice only. And so I think there's also a lot of take home stuff where you can talk to folks that guide them through medical reminders. We did an app with WaterPick that reminded you to floss or do the WaterPick thing, whatever that's called, pick every night, because they know that if they can get you to do it 15 nights in a row, you're going to do it for life, whereas only like a small percentage of people do that. Most people get it as a present and then it goes under the thing and it never comes out. So I think there's very specific use cases that might not apply as much to the financial services space.
One of the use cases that I can think of right now, and it has been applied, is on the treatment floor, which is very local, just like the hospital room. And one bank, not going to say who, but they created an internal tool that automates reports. So if a trader needs a report on a ticker or something, they can just say what they need, and it pulls everything up. So why haven't things like that been more mainstream?
Yeah, I think it's a weird one, right? Because almost everything that we work in, healthcare, is way behind financial services because it's so heavily regulated. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you. Let me think about it. Yep.
This is kind of a similar question. You talked a lot about banking. Have you done anything with brokerage on the consumer side, investments, talking to them about their stocks, bonds, stuff like
Yeah,
that?
so we've done a lot on the very straightforward reporting stuff. I think there's a lot of work being done right now on robo investments, et cetera, and robo guidance. And I think that is an area where you kind of have to divide what's happening into two pieces. One is what is AI doing in terms of a big data side, and then two is what's happening on the voice side. And so I think a lot of that has lagged behind because the AI on the data side isn't yet, from what I've seen, quite at the point where it's reliable at scale. I think once it becomes reliable, then you'll see people putting a voice experience on top of that where you can just ask the system, hey, take a look at my portfolio. Any suggestions? It's a wide open kind of question. But that's what voice is particularly suited for, is those kind of wide open search concepts.
I do think one of the things that will continue to be a challenge is just the regulatory and compliance partners within financial services.
Yeah.
And that may be some of the limitation, right? Why it hasn't extended into more wealth management and brokerage areas, just because of those compliance and regulatory concerns. So reading off a not may, right?
Yeah.
For every single balance or trade that you might that make from a voice perspective, that may not be so great.
Yeah. And there's legal underpinnings, right? You know, there's a lot of legal protections around. I got bad advice, but if you get bad advice from a bot, who's responsible for that? All right, time has been called. All right, thank you.